And so I was in this light and I was like, woohoo, I'm ready to go. It felt like I was on kind of like this way station or this platform of a train station, not in visual or physicality, but that was just kind of like the feeling because where I was just pure light. I was a sphere of light. We were in light. And why I say we is because there were two beings that were approaching me from far off in the distance.
Hello, thank you for tuning in. My name is Nella, and welcome to my podcast, Ethereality. Today's guest is Lee Papa. Lee, I'm so grateful to have you here. Why don't you go ahead and tell us about your near-death experience?
Thank you for having me, first off. The thing about near-death experiences, all of us who have had them can jump into the actual experience itself, which of course I will. But the reason why my book has a tagline that says an exploration of life, death, and spiritual wisdom through a near-death experience is because that's what happens, right? It's not just the death or the near-death experience. It's about the life ahead of time and then the life after, right? And of course, we know that there is no death. So it's always just life, 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 right?
Just different levels of life.
Different variations of life, right? But to follow your lead, in 2008, I had an experience where previously my life was very much full of drama and chaos and self-fulfilling prophecies, if you will, because my self-talk was that which was less than optimal. Changed my language very much since then, but less than optimal because it was creating my reality, which was that of contrast, that of chaos and drama and unhappiness. And I looked outside myself for all of it. I looked outside myself for fulfillment and for happiness and for soothing and thought it was all outside of myself. And then I saw the drama or the chaos or the conflict as also outside of myself. So I navigated as a victim. This is happening to me. The summer of 2008 was a very interesting year on many levels, but I had my elderly mother living with my husband and my young toddler son, who is 2 years old. My husband, we moved from Los Angeles to Las Vegas to accommodate my elderly mother coming to live with us. And in that process of moving, we were very excited about a new opportunity, a new city, having my mom come and giving her a chance to really thrive because she was elderly. She had fallen and broken her hip. She was living in Maryland. She was alone a lot. She was lonely. She was calling me, and we would speak every day. We were like two peas in a pod, right? Our relationship was super, super close. She was my best friend, and she was always complaining. Now, what you'll also learn the backstory in the book is that is kind of a common thread of my family is they focus on the negative, kind of lifting up the martyr, lifting up the people that are struggling. And so we were raised in the kind of concept of, oh, poor fill in the blank of that person, right? So we really thought that moving mom to Vegas with us was going to give her, a new chapter. She was going to thrive. It was going to be great. We get to Vegas in December of 2003, and early 2004, my husband was in an automobile accident where he was rear-ended at a stoplight. He had nowhere to go. He could see the truck coming, but he could not move anywhere, so he had to brace himself. And that is a moment that changed the trajectory of all of our lives. So he was in chronic pain. He had neck and back injury. And that story goes on to hospitalization, a lawsuit that just documented his disability and his pain every single day. And if you know about the language, right, about the power of our language and our unconscious, our subconscious, our conscious minds, and how we program ourselves, you know that if you are documenting and you're writing your disability every single day for 4 years, what's going to happen? Right? It's just going to perpetuate the disability. but that's the way the system is set up. So this is what he did. And then he ended up getting pneumonia and he was hospitalized, almost died, major steroids to keep him alive. There was just a lot. And so in this young family that had such potential for happiness, the bright light was that I was a 42-year-old mom, the same age as my mom had me, blessed with a beautiful, healthy baby boy, and he was our light. In the kind of drama of our lives, there were a lot of different complications that had to do with my mom really becoming a shadow of who she was, and my husband, who was falling into a deep depression, into a hole of despair, of physical disability. We were not thriving. And then I was sick all the time. I had everything that came down the pike, and that's what I would say. Don't get near me if you're sick, I'm going to get it, right? So I affirmed all this illness, and in my internal struggle, it manifests in the physical form. So I had upper respiratory infection, so right around the heart, right? So the lungs around the heart, and if you follow chakras, that would mean something, right? Throat infections, urinary tract infections, and if you're familiar with Louise Hay's book, You Can Heal Your Life, all of those emotional traumas and triggers can be manifested in the physical form with dis-ease in the body. So I was getting signals left and right. And so my husband at the time decided, because we are no longer married, we had decided that he wanted to go for a retreat, a 10-day Vipassana, which is a 10-day Noble Silence retreat in Colorado, to really help him get through this trauma that he was dealing with. During that time, I was again sick, and I had at that point really moved away from medications for all these illnesses that I had. I was working on myself holistically. It wasn't working. And so I had agreed to go and get some antibiotics so that he felt comfortable going into this 10 days of noble silence, because there's no communication. They take your phone. There was like no communication for 10 days. In that process, I did that. He went into noble silence, and I proceeded to get very ill. The antibiotics weren't working. Days went by. At one point, I wasn't sure what was happening with my son, what he was doing. I didn't know the last time I had water or I had something to drink. My mother, who was always there, seemed to disappear. And then I found myself lifting outside my body. Once I realized that, oh, I could transition, I was able to grab my phone and call my girlfriend, who is actually my son's godmother, to come get him because I was very ill. And she did, and she said she'd keep him overnight. And that kind of gave me a sense of peace that, oh, okay, at least he was taken care of. And as soon as she took him, I laid in bed and I went to the light. My spirit left my body, and I felt this freedom that was not ever felt before, this natural bliss that was just so extraordinary, the love. And most near-death experiencers talk about the love, but what's funny about that is that the love and the word that we have is not what it is. It is so much more, so more expansive, so much fuller than what our really concept could ever be. We can't possibly understand the concept because we're so programmed into what we think love is, the conditions of what we think love is. And so I was in this light and I was like, woohoo, I'm ready to go. It felt like I was in this way station or this platform of a train station, not in visual or physicality, but that was just kind of like the feeling, because where I was just pure light. I was a sphere of light. We were in light. And why I say we is because there were two beings that were approaching me from far off in the distance. And I didn't have a body. I had no qualms about not having a body. And these two beings came towards me and communicated with me telepathically. And I did not know them. They were not a religious figure that I knew. They weren't a family member. I just called them light beings because they glowed light. And they morphed into two different kind of outlines because they were also light. So there was the expansive light, the most whitest of lights you can imagine, lightning strike white. And then I was light, and then these light beings were light, but you could differentiate kind of by the outline or the variations of light. And they communicated with me that it was not my time. I did have free will to make a choice.
So the outlines, were they shaped like human outlines?
Yes,
Okay.
yes, great question. And the one on the left was a little taller and fuller that felt very masculine. The one on the right was a little smaller and felt feminine energetically. But they morphed in and out like into the outline of a human form. And then they communicated with me individually as well as one united consciousness. And so when we went through this process, because I was ready to go, I was like I was home. I describe it as like getting off of this roller coaster that you have really wanted to go on and you're really exhilarated by the ride. But, you know, when you start coming into the platform and you're like, woo, that was an amazing ride. Yeah, and I don't need to go on that again, right? Okay, it was like, okay, I had the experience. Now I'm ready to, go home and relax. And it kind of felt like that, like it was a ride, and I'm so glad I'm done. But what they explained to me is they wanted me to go through what I described as a relationship review. And for many years, I didn't listen or read about anyone else's near-death experience because I just didn't want it to kind of filter into mine. But over the last couple of years, I have explored others and listened to them, and I've found it interesting about common threads and also those that are very different. But so instead of a life review per se, mine was a relationship review. And so I would feel the energy of a person, but it was the relationship that I had, the wisdom, the knowledge that I gleaned from the relationship, and the pure love and just adoration, really, of the experience of the soul that was that person. There were no woulda, coulda, shouldas around it.
So when you were able to witness those experiences with people you had relationships with, did you also have like a multi-dimensional perspective where you were able to experience their thoughts and feelings as well?
No.
Oh.
So, yeah. So, no, I didn't. There was not one iota of judgment around this experience. And it was all just pure love and appreciation and the wisdom and knowledge gleaned from the experience. And I know that I received a lot of different relationships, key people, like my soul team. But the only two that I remembered were my husband and my son. So when one experience, and it was all very visceral, so I would feel the feeling, and then as it faded, the next one would come. And then as the one that I remembered of my husband, we were in a very troubled relationship. And it had been going on for some time, a very challenging relationship. But there was none of that in the NDE. It was only this extraordinary love and appreciation for the soul that was known as Jean Pierre in the book, and the wisdom and knowledge gleaned from the experience. And then as he started to fade away, they brought in my son, and they wanted me to feel that. And it felt like these two light beings had a job to do, which was to convince me to go back. They didn't quite really say that, like, come out and blurt that out, but it was evident that they were like chosen for the job. It was purposeful. And so they left my son, again, a toddler. And oh, the yumminess of the love of this being was so extraordinary, so beautiful, so soft, and just, oh, I mean, yummy is just the only word that I can really come up with, because it was just so precious and beautiful, softer than what I had felt for my husband. The love was just softer and purer. And I just was so appreciative of the love and the experience and the wisdom and knowledge that I gained from being this little one's mother for such a short time, but even the process of birthing him. And so after that feeling faded, I was like, okay, let's go. Now, this is interesting piece to the puzzle because, I came back with certain messages of what I am to share. And one of the messages is non-attachment. And those of us who have children, fur babies, relationships that we are very attached to, this is where the rub comes about the idea of love. The way that we love here on the planet is we love with attachment. For us to get to really that expansive love, there is no attachment. And if you can even consider or even tap into that for one tiny second, to love so purely and to have no attachment. So my little one, as much as I loved him, and believe me, the third dimensional Lee was very attached. I was a helicopter mom. I had eyeballs on him constantly. I was incredibly attached. But there, it was just pure love. So I was still ready to go. These beings said, well, you don't have enough information to make this decision. We want you to understand that this little being, Luke in the book, would not be able to fulfill his destiny if he lost his mom at such a young age. And I was like, oh, apparently your personality goes with you, because I was negotiating even on the other side. It's like, oh, he'll be fine. He's an old soul. His dad's a good dad. They have a great relationship. He's going to be okay. Right. And there's like, well, we want you to feel the feeling of what this little being would feel at the loss of his mother. And I have to say that for the first 6 months, probably to a year after the NDE, I couldn't even tell this part of the story without just bursting into bawling my eyes out, because it was just so visceral. And what it felt like was shards of glass ripping through my soul. It was horrific. And you wouldn't wish that kind of grief, that kind of pain on your worst enemy, much less a little being, a little baby, right? So, or your son.
Yeah, especially having just experienced the fullest magnitude in a multi-dimensional perspective of the love that you shared.
Indeed.
Just right after that. Wow,
The
yeah.
juxtaposition was quite great, right? I
Yeah.
mean, they did their job well. And that's kind of what I said is, oh, you're good, right? Because as soon as that happened, I was like, all right, I'm going back. I will be this little one's mom until he doesn't need me anymore. And I will, part of the negotiation is that I do the work of the light, and was, figuring out what that was. And then some additional negotiations of how I get to transition came about. And then I was back.
Do you remember what those negotiations were?
Oh, yes.
I am very curious about that.
The negotiations were, when I am ready to go, I get to go. And no drawn out illness, no struggle. When I decide to go, I get to go. And it was agreed.
Ah, that's
So
a
I'm
good
like,
deal.
yeah, I'm glad I thought of it. That was the big thing. And then it's instantly when it was like agreed, I was back. I was basically on my deathbed, and I sat up in bed and I was alert. I remembered everything except for like all the relationships, right? But everything was like very vivid and everything was different. So I sat up in bed going, what and an expletive, add whichever one you'd like, just happened to me, because I didn't know. And I was
Ha-
calling it a fantasy of death.
Had you heard about any near-death experience stuff before this happened?
Probably somewhere along the way, but not in my conscious mind, because I had always been a spiritual seeker, but it wasn't anything that I followed or really, I had never read a book or anything like that about near-death experiences. So not really, because I really didn't know what it was. Again, fantasy of death is what I was calling it. And everything was glowing. It had a vibration that was just amplified. I sat in bed looking at everything and I thought, I need help. I didn't know how much time had gone by that I was staring at this door in all its parts, the hinges and the doorknob, thinking it was just so extraordinarily beautiful.
So everything was glowing, you said.
Yeah, everything had a life to it. It was
E
just amplified.
Even the man-made things.
Yes. I was in such a stupor that I was just present. There was no noodling. Again, this was not me. The me would be trying to figure it out. I've always been what I called myself, a spiritual seeker. I'm a seeker. I want to make known the unknown. I want to know all the mysteries of life and yada, yada, yada. But this, I was just back and baffled and in it. I was basically on my deathbed. And then all of a sudden I was 90, I don't know, some percent well and different. Something had touched me. I had this residue that was left on me that I didn't really understand. And so I called my sister, and she had been studying meditation and some more esoteric spiritual practices through meditation. And I said, "Can I talk to you?" And I just kind of blurted the whole thing out. And she didn't say a word, let me get through the entire story. And when I was like, "What do you think?" And she blurted out, like, she, in this exuberance, "Oh my God, you had, an exit opportunity, and people have exit opportunities. And I've never known anybody that had an exit opportunity." And she was just like talking really fast. And I'm like, whoa, little too much for me after just coming back from a very long trip, apparently. And got off the phone with her, and still, okay, so that was a little bit more information, but still in kind of this base that was just so beautiful and blissful. And then I called another friend of mine who was a spiritual confidant, and I respected her journey. Called her and asked her what she thought, and she referred me to her spiritual advisor who was out of state. And I contacted Rosa, who is a spiritual coach, mentor, and she said it was a near-death experience. She said, "I've had 3," I think she said. And she said, "It's textbook." She was saying, "Do you feel this way? Do you feel this way? Is this what you're experiencing?" And I was like, check, 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 check. She said, "It's a textbook near-death experience." And she said, "What you're feeling, this residue is going to go. It'll slowly kind of dissolve away after a couple of weeks." And she was right on. So she said, "Journal it because you'll miss it." And I absolutely did, because it's like you settle back into the density of this world, and it's not as great as the other side. But that's
Yeah.
the actual near-death experience. I came back with some extrasensory, people might say gifts, but they're really what we all have access to, and set me on a trajectory of doing the work that I do today.
Did you have any sort of religious or spiritual upbringing?
So I was born and raised Catholic, and from early on, I would say probably 12, I felt like something was off for me, that some of what I was being taught, that there's a chosen group, or that it has to be a certain way for you to be saved or go to heaven. Some things were just not sitting well with me. And even at that age, I was exploring, didn't really start exploring other religions or philosophies until I moved from Maryland to Los Angeles, and started exploring New Age, Buddhism, Hinduism, Jewish texts. And I just love to talk to people. And that's really my studying is, what is your belief system? And I guess that's really what my study was more about belief system than actual religions. And then I kind of went full circle because this work isn't always easy. I'm not sure if it's ever easy, but I've tried to not do it. I went through a period of time post COVID, and my son was going off to college, and really just removed myself from the work that I do, isolated in a very small town in Missouri, and did a deep dive into Christianity. Studied the Bible for the first time in my life, because as Catholics, we don't really study the Bible, or at least I hadn't. And it brought another level of understanding and wisdom. And with each step of the way, more understanding, more wisdom comes. And so I do believe in Jesus. I do believe in God. I've always believed in God. That's never wavered. In the book, I talk about when I was younger, and I was living in Baltimore, and again, probably 12, 13. My mom said to me, "Who do you pray to?" Now, my mother was devout to the Blessed Mother, prayed the rosary, prayed to the Blessed Mother every day. And yet, I'm going to take you to the point when she was elderly and was dying, she was petrified to die. someone who was so devout, but petrified to die. I didn't really understand that. But when I was young, she asked me who I prayed to, and I said, I thought it was like a trick question, like, God? Like, who do you pray to? And, she had a litany of, Saint Joseph and Saint Anthony and the Blessed Mother. And I came to realize that at some point along the way, she just never felt worthy. God is, I can't even imagine not having God be the focus and the main part of your life. Another gal had said to me, do you pray? This was many years ago. And I'm like, hopefully my life is a prayer. That's my intention, is that my life is a prayer. Do I sit and sometimes fold my hands? Yes. I don't need to fold my hands. God is always with me. God is within me. And that really is part of the evolution of a spiritual journey, is coming to that realization, in my humble opinion.
I feel like gratitude is a prayer.
Absolutely.
So you said the work that you do. You kind of touched on what you are doing today. What is that? What do you do?
So when I came back from the near-death experience, it certainly changes you. I think anybody coming back from that experience will say that. And it doesn't matter if anybody believes you or not, you're different. That experience, no one can take that away. And even in the darkest times of my life, I always go back to that experience because that is the purest truth that I know. So I weigh everything against that pure truth of the near-death experience. When I came back, I actually came back with half my face paralyzed. It turned out to be a Bell's palsy. Recovered from that, realized that stress was going to be a significant thing for me, meaning learning how to not live my life in stress.
How did you discover that it was your own mindset and approach to life that was creating this constant string of illnesses?
Again, the journey, it's really breadcrumbs, spirit. And when I talk about God, I will say creator, God, source, the divine universe, spirit, George, because it's not a disrespect. It is that God doesn't care what you call him. And if you call him or her, God, the creation of all that is so loving, so unbelievably loving and forgiving. He just wants a relationship with you. And so I had breadcrumbs given to me, and the signposts are there for all of us. Our spiritual journey is just that. It is an awakening, and it isn't a bop on your head, and all of a sudden, you're back and you know everything and everything is going to be perfect. It's not, because then we don't learn anything. I do want to get back to your question. You asked me what I do, right?
Oh, yes.
So when I came back, I just followed the breadcrumbs, meaning the synchronicities, the doors that would open. I have an intuitive channel. So it opened up a part of my consciousness that I actually receive information, imprints, can hear the voice of spirit. And navigating that is like a whole nother language, right? And you have to learn it like a language. But I was guided to open up a wellness center, and I did. I opened up a center to do Reiki, which is a Japanese form of energy healing. And it's a really great first step of spiritual awakening and going through the process of healing. We're all in the process of healing. Absolutely every one of us is in a process of healing, because that's why we come here, for the contrast. I opened up this center. It was 2 rooms that became 2, 3, 4, 6, 12, 13 in an executive suite, and then contiguous space. We ended up moving into its own 6,000 square foot space that included a cafe and retail place and an event space. While it was open, we did over, oh my gosh, 4,000 classes, and tens of thousands of people came through there. It was very well known in Las Vegas, and it was guided, 100% guided. And then I started receiving the message global. And this is the fun thing about spirit, is you don't get the full picture. And then your third dimensional mind wants to fill in all the gaps, right? We never fill them in properly. So I kept hearing global. I'm like, oh, are we supposed to make the center global? We had an extraordinary team of volunteers and people that were involved with the center, and practitioners and teachers. It was really extraordinary. And so I started, going down the road of how do we open centers elsewhere when this one really wasn't profitable? How do I do that? Spent a lot of time, unnecessary time, because then I just received a phone call out of the blue, which is what kind of happens. A gal who said, I'm a representative of an international meeting planners conference, and we're interested in having you come in and speak on the topic of wellness for this 14,000 person attendee conference. And that was global. So I went and saw this extraordinary group of people, saw the way that stress was being worn like a badge of honor. And Spirit said to me, this is it. Close the center, and you're going to start bringing mindfulness and meditation to help with stress relief, because people are not going to open themselves up and go on their spiritual journey when they're so bogged down in stress and illness and chaos and conflict. And we have to meet them where they are. And that's where I was. So I had already been on that journey myself. So I was able to then see it in other people. So I ended up closing the center and creating a keynote, How to Live and Lead Mindfully, and created a side kind of program that taught meditation and mindfulness within conferences and events, and continue to write books. So I wrote my story, The Temple of All Knowing, first in 2014. And then I just released the 10th anniversary edition, which I would recommend not to buy the first one, to definitely buy the second one. I'm a much better writer. And what I did is I kept the voice of it the same as that experience, because I felt that as much as I wanted to rewrite the whole book, it was a point in time, and that our journeys do evolve. And it's important to highlight the steps of the journey. And if we don't open ourselves up for change in our beliefs or our evolution or our journey, then we atrophy, and we atrophy mentally, spiritually, emotionally, physically. If we don't exercise, we're going to atrophy. So I felt it was really important to keep it true to the message when it happened. I did a new intro and a new closing. Very proud of this edition of the book. And then I have a book on mindfulness, which is a year of mindfulness for beginners, daily mantras, meditations, and prompts. And I do audiobooks. And actually, this was kind of how I stretched myself, is a really wonderful author. Joan Peck writes romance novels. And I was able to voice one of her romance novels called Santa Baby, which was super fun. Anyway, so that's what I do now. So I teach, I'm a coach. I support people in shifting out of grief and mindsets and limiting beliefs, and really anything that you find yourself stuck in, I support you in moving you through that in a very short period of time. We are here on the planet during an extraordinary time in history with great contrast. Now I'm going to give you a little bit of a mindfulness lesson. So mindfulness at its simplest form equals awareness. Okay. So mindfulness equals awareness of your thoughts and your actions in the world around you in non-judgment. Okay, so that's huge, right? So of course it's called a practice. It's not something that you conquer, achieve, or overcome, which is what we're all trained to do, right? We're overachievers. We need to conquer it. We need to move on, conquer, move on, conquer, move on. Okay, this is not what that is. This is awareness of your thoughts and actions in the world around you in non-judgment. Who do we judge the most?
Well, a lot of people would say themselves.
Yes. So we judge ourselves the most, and you can find out those who judge themselves the most are the ones that are judging externally. So the work that I do is I help people understand whatever that pain is. And one of the, I guess, extra gifts that I received when I came back is the empathic nature. So I can feel where someone's pain is in their body, where it came from, typically a timeline of when it came, and I support people into healing that. The residual effect is that things resolve. So whether it's a physical manifestation of an illness or a dis-ease in the body, all those chronic illnesses that I had, gone, completely gone, because I healed the emotional body. And I work a lot with the healthcare industry and also like law enforcement, people that help other people because they're suffering too. We need to get to the people where they are. And my message may not resonate with everyone, probably won't. And I'll say, take what resonates and leave the rest because there just might be a tiny, if you're here listening to this, there might be a tiny little nugget just for you. And if it's not for you, just don't judge it, leave it on the side because it's going to be for somebody else. Or it just might be a seed for you later. But if we don't look within ourselves for our own healing, there is nothing we can do about the external world. So we take full responsibility of what's going inside. And again, a byproduct of my journey is I looked outside myself for everything and I felt like a victim. And in this work, there is no victim because I want to empower you to take responsibility for your own healing through, my guidance is like shining a flashlight on the shadowy places because we're so stressed out. All that static isn't allowing us to see what we need to see. We can't change the external until we change the internal. Can't change our spouse or our friends or our partners or our children or, our parents or anyone, our neighbor who's driving us crazy. We can't, our bosses, we can't change anyone but ourselves. And when we shift ourselves, the external changes. So my work, my, marching orders is to help people heal that within themselves because it's a ripple effect. And as you hear my meditations or you hear my voice in an interview or you read the book, it is all part of the energetic kind of reprogramming of our world that we stop blaming and judging. We go within to heal the wounds that are there from, our childhood, from past lives, ancestral issues, that once we clear that, then there is a ripple effect out in the world. And hopefully we will move into a space that is more like the space in the NDE than it is in the world that we're living in such contrast.
If you're getting any value out of this podcast, please hit that like button and subscribe. Also, if you've enjoyed my content before, or maybe you're new here, but you like it, drop a comment and let me know you're here. I would love to get to know my audience. Thank you for listening, and let's get back to the content.
You'll hear me use the word contrast a lot because I try not to use the labels of all the things that we can label as bad. I'll air quote the word bad because we can label all kinds of stuff that would be a bad label, right? Whether it's pain or sure you can come up with a bunch of stuff in your life, but I choose to label it all as just contrast because it diffuses the energy. You see the power of the words. It diffuses the energy of it and the judgment of it. When it's just contrast, you realize that contrast is your greatest teacher. And we're here for the contrast because when we're on the other side, it's bliss 24/7. You don't learn anything. You're just in bliss. It's that multi-million-dollar view that is just awesome. But over time, what happens is you stop seeing that extraordinary view. It becomes just,
Normalized.
normal. You crave the contrast because you gain wisdom and knowledge, and that's what it's all about. So when we realize that we're here purposely for the contrast, we look at contrast very differently. You can tell I get passionate about that. You look at the contrast very differently, and then you almost embrace it. I said almost because sometimes it's really hard to embrace the contrast, but you look at it differently. And as the mindful observer, you're taking a beat, you're leaning out, right? When you are in the middle of the contrast, you're in the middle of it because you're being the participant and you're being whipped around and triggered. It's painful, emotionally painful. But when you're the mindful observer, you're leaning out and you're taking that beat and you're like, oh, look at that contrast. Oh, look at how that presented for me. Thank you. Thank you for that contrast because now I see you for what you are. I know that mirror, I need to do a little more healing around XYZ, and then I won't need you to show up again.
I can resonate so much with what you're saying because I have a mantra in my life. It's who knows what's good or bad. Have you heard the parable of the Chinese farmer?
Go ahead. Let's hear
Well,
it.
Alan Watts also talks about it, and
I
he
love
says,
Helen Watts.
no, I love this story. It's funny too because you're like, oh, I get really passionate about this. So do I.
That's
Um,
why you do what you do.
yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So, this parable of the Chinese farmer, there was a farmer and his son, and they lived in a small village. They had a horse that helped them plow the fields. One morning, he woke up and went outside, found out that the horse had escaped its stable. So his friends in the village came around and said, "Oh, I'm so sorry for your loss." And the farmer shrugged his shoulders and said, "Who knows what's good or bad?" So then the next day, he wakes up in the morning, goes outside, and finds that his horse had returned and brought with it another horse from the enemy neighboring state. And everyone came around and said, "Oh my goodness, what great fortune has fallen upon you." And he shrugs his shoulders and says, "Who knows what's good or bad?" Later that afternoon, his son went out to the stable to try to break in the new horse, was bucked off its back, and broke his leg. And everyone in the village came around again and said, "Oh, what misfortunes. So sorry this has happened to you." And he says, "Who knows what's good or bad?" Then the following day, the military rolled in and was drafting all the young, able-bodied men for the military to fight in the war against the enemy neighboring state. But they took one look at his son and his broken leg and said, "You are unfit for war." And he was left behind. Then everyone came around and said, "Wow, what great fortune has come upon you. Your son gets to stay and live out the war with you, and all of our children have been taken away from us and likely will never return." But he also says, again, shrugs his shoulders and says, "Who knows what's good or bad?" So the moral of the story is we try to label these things as good and bad, but it's often the things that we try to label as bad turns out to be a blessing, and then there's things that we attach ourselves, you're talking about non-attachment, attach ourselves that we label as good that turns out to hurt us deeply in the end. And it's just a futile effort, I believe, to try to label things as good or bad and to simply observe it. I like the way that you put it as contrast. It's brilliant. I love that. But I live by that. Who knows what's good or bad?
Beautiful. First of all, I have heard that story and you tell it perfectly. So
Thank
thank
you.
you for sharing that with everyone because it's a great reminder. I will use optimal and less than optimal. So when I'm coaching people, I'm like, okay, so I give them a very short amount of time to tell their story. And it's usually based in the contrast, right? And let them use all the words that they want to use to describe their story. Okay, now from now on, because there are no victims here, you explained the story, right? We're going to do optimal and less than optimal. We look for that equanimous state, which is what the story is talking about. Being in the equanimous state, which is basically, even, right? No high highs, no low lows. My previous pre-near-death experience and pre-healing, right? I had a lot of high highs, a lot of low lows. You get addicted to the high highs, all that spiking. And then the low lows don't feel so good. And when you do the work, because it is work, the inner work is very real. When you do the work of your healing, emotional healing, your spiritual expansion, you start hovering in that sweet zone of the equanimous state.
Mhm.
And that is what your story talks about. Your story is, saying who's to say what's good or bad, right? One of my mantras is creator is vying for your highest and best always. So no matter what happens, I always say that to my son, whatever hiccup you've got, creator is vying for your highest and best. So let's see what happens. Now, intention has a long way to go. If your intention is that you want to do something in the world that is very different from what you are doing, we talk about vibration. You want to raise your vibration to a higher level out of the contrast. So, not in the lower rungs of jealousy or worry or doubt, right? But more in the joy and happiness and contentment. spaces, that is a vibrational scale. So you are staying more in a higher vibrational scale. Well, something has to change around you. I call it the colander effect. And I visualize one of those old time Tupperware colander that is like this bright yellow, has all the holes in it. We're this vibrational being in this colander. And what no longer serves us because we're doing the healing work, we're doing the inner work, the personal development, whatever label you want to put on it, that which no longer serves you or is a vibrational match is going to fall out the holes. Now, human nature is we don't want things to fall out the holes. We want that new job or that new relationship or the prosperity or the health or the change in our life. But unless we let go of that which no longer serves us, we don't allow room for anything new to come. And the universal law is that things will shift. So if things happen that are perceived as negative, we know that, right, it's not good or it's bad. It's shifting.
It's creating space.
It's creating space, but sometimes things that are perceived to be bad need to go away so that something else can come, right? Optimal or less than optimal.
I love that you brought that up because I was recently discussing with a couple of my friends who it seems like both of them were losing people close to them at the same time. And what I know about frequency and energy and everything, I kind of got on a soapbox. I was like, all right, hold on, be ready for my TED Talk. But I was talking about how once you do elevate, you elevate to a higher frequency, all the things that resonated with your previous frequency are no longer an energetic match to you. And so those things are falling away. And to us, it looks like we're losing something. It looks like, everything is falling apart, but really it's falling into place so that you can then have this available space for things to come into your life that are an energetic match with you.
That's
And
right. That's the colander effect, right?
yeah, and it's funny too because I spent the majority of my 20s thinking that I couldn't make friends at all. Like I had this narrative that I couldn't make friends. And I realized later in life, like closer to my 30s, that it wasn't that I wasn't capable of making friends. It was that I was trying to force connections with people that didn't have an energetic match to my
That's right.
frequency.
That's right.
All these connections that I had from high school and my early 20s and stuff that I thought that, we had these really close relationships with, it didn't make sense to me why we couldn't maintain our relationship. And I thought there was something wrong with me. But it was really just we're operating on different frequencies.
Absolutely. And it's not one is bad and one is good. And you just made a very
Yes.
good point about operating on different frequencies. It's just like a radio station. So you can tune into a pop station or country station or hip hop station. I joke about it. I'm like, these stations aren't judging each other. They're just different frequencies, but maybe they are judging each other, right? But they're different frequencies on the radio station, right? It's the same thing because people get stuck when you say you're raising your frequency and people are falling out the holes, and that perception is that those people are bad and I'm good. I'm like, no, there's no judgment there. We're all on the light train going home. And sometimes you're on the fast train, sometimes you're on the slow train, sometimes you're jumping trains. Sometimes you think, oh yeah, I'm all this. I am jamming. I am feeling great. I'm done all this work on myself. And then all of a sudden you get kicked off, to the slow train because you didn't quite learn the lesson that you were here to learn. None of it is about judgment. And that is the trick of the ego. And also in like the healing arts, the ego can get very involved. People start getting highly intuitive or psychic or energy healing, and then they call themselves healers. And the ego is very loud and wants to be seen and wants to have this persona that they are doing it. And part of my message is that it's all God. It's all God. So if we're not putting God first, even I'm like in your personal life, and I'm not saying that you have to stand outside your front stoop and, and preach the word. I'm saying that putting God in charge with you in your life should be number one. I learned that over time. Like, what are we doing today? What do you want me to do today? What do you want me to say today on this lovely podcast? Make sure you drop it in. Make sure if there's something you want me to say, I'm a voice box for you. Spirit, tell me. And that's, I'm sure, what you do, and you may not even consciously know that you do that.
I do that. It was actually brought to my attention by Sarah Snow. She told me that I intuitively receive questions and impulses to draw out certain parts of the conversation specifically because my audience needs to hear it. It seems like a really simple concept, but to me, it was really profound because it resonated with me. And then after she had said that, I started noticing it actually happening. And I was like, oh
Yeah.
gosh, she was very right. But
So it's a drop in. That's
yeah.
when you know that spirit is giving you something, because it kind of just like drops. It's like
Mhm.
it just drops into your consciousness. It's not like when you are thinking through it, there seems to be a thread of when one thing leads to another. But when spirit gives you something, it's just there. It's an inspired thought, if you will.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm really grateful that you had brought up the fact that resonating on different frequencies doesn't necessarily make one right and the other wrong.
Or better,
Or
right?
better, yeah, or worse. And when I navigate my relationships, it's a practice. I mean, at first it was a very difficult thing. It was one of those, it's easier said than done kind of things. But once I really adopted that and recognizing that just because this person's opinion or the things that they want for their life or their values are different from mine, it doesn't make mine right and theirs wrong. And I think that being able to communicate that in situations where you're maybe going separate directions or not really compatible with a person, but telling them directly that it's not because my values are better than yours, it's simply because they're different.
You have no idea where it's going to go either. So
Yeah.
it's just less than optimal at this moment.
Less than optimal at this moment. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, I like that. I really believe that being able to communicate that to people in my life has cultivated so much more respect between me and the people that
Well,
have
it's
been in my life.
authentic.
Yeah.
And I think that's what we also need to make sure that the message is that we need to lead our lives from a place of authenticity, because otherwise we turn ourselves into pretzels. And that's when all this, mental and emotional gymnastics goes on, where you're one way with certain friends and another way with family and another way at your job or whatever. It's bringing everything into wholeness to be your authentic self. And yes, people will fall away, and that's okay. And more people are falling away. I don't know if you're hearing that or if you're experiencing that, but we're in the middle of a spiritual war. So the vibration of the planet, as dark as it seems, depending on where you look, right? It's also awakening. And so as we have mass consciousness awakening to the truth of who we are, that which no longer serves is going to, and I don't mean this in a negative way, but is going to fall away. A vibrational match, like we were talking about. And to be okay with people moving in different directions. There are people that have been in my life that I don't see or talk to anymore, but it doesn't mean that I don't love them. And if they showed up at my doorstep, I would welcome them and love them as the human experience that we're having. We are souls having a physical experience. To judge someone else for their journey is really only to judge ourselves. A couple
Yeah.
things I was thinking about is like the NDE that I'd like to touch on. My NDE, I was met by two light beings. When I was writing my book, the original version of the book, I was in a very special place in California that I absolutely adore. I was in a coffee shop. A gal came up to me and said, are you Lee Papa? Which was a very surreal thing at the moment, because I'm like, how would anybody know I'm here? Much less a stranger. She said, I understand that you are writing a book about a near-death experience. And I said, yes. And she said, well, my husband had a near-death experience. I'd love to tell you about it. Awesome. So we're in line waiting, and she proceeds to tell me about the near-death experience. She was owning it. I mean, it was like it was hers because she was so lit up about it. And her husband was met by Jesus and some, I believe, angelic beings. How she described it was beautiful. A lot of the same commonalities about love and the feeling. When she finished it, she said, I'm so glad we were right. And I said, I think that's amazing. I greeted her with, there's nothing more profound in my opinion, right, than to have this near-death experience and be able to come back and share that. And I'm so happy that you and your husband had that experience. But it got me thinking afterwards, right? And the book actually is kind of like it's written as it's happening. It was based on the near-death experience, but it was also about life, right? So that's why I was saying life and death and spiritual wisdom. So it was kind of unfolding as I was writing it. And I just thought, well, what if? And I love that phrase about what if, because it allows us to stretch our belief. And if we don't stretch, like we said before, we atrophy, right? So to be able to be the observer and allow other people to have their experiences without judgment of their experiences, but to be open to, well, what if? I thought, what if she was right too? What if we're all right? What if when we're on the other side, when we have this near-death experience, it's all based on our own beliefs? What if?
That's something I have gathered. I've heard thousands of these stories at this point. I've been interviewing people for the last couple years. And I mean, it's hard to say that I can conclude, that like I know for
Right.
sure. But the understanding that I have cultivated over time is that we ultimately create our experience on the other side based off of what we hold as our narratives and our belief systems and our experience while we are here.
Well, I love it. I think it's a great exploration. I don't know why I didn't see Jesus. Maybe because I didn't go all the way, because I really felt like I was in a tweener stage.
There's
Because
definitely different
they
layers.
yeah, they didn't
Yeah.
want me to go all the way, because I definitely wouldn't have come back. But here's another perspective. And this was just one of those whoa moments where I was having this conversation with my girlfriend. We were talking about that there's free will, right? So we have free will, and all these NDEs, we get to decide whether we come back. And usually it's like instantaneous. When you hear people talk about it, like they decide that they want to come back for whatever reason, and it's instantaneous that they're back. What if all death are NDEs? Because we have free will. So they just chose to go. There's no accidents, there's no illness, there's just choice. It's all free will.
No, I see what you're saying.
Right? And I was like,
Right.
whoa, that's like powerful.
That's amazing. It
Right?
is interesting though that some people have cardiac arrest for a couple minutes or something and they come back with no memory of having anything outside of body.
Right.
But that doesn't necessarily mean there isn't anything happening.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, like my sister said about exit opportunities, this is what her belief is. I think it was Sylvia Brown. Oh, Sylvia Brown, I think that was her name, had said that we have multiple opportunities to leave this lifetime throughout our lives, and some we choose them or we don't choose them. So again, free will.
Mm-hmm.
I knew that in my relationship reviews that there were more, but I was only given the two to remember,
Mm-hmm.
because those were the two that were most important for the story, right? Most
Mm-hmm.
important for the message to tell the world. I mean, I've had extraordinary supernatural experiences, some of which are written in the book. Extraordinary experiences. And I just want to like shake everybody and say, we are not our bodies. We are extraordinary spiritual beings, and we are so much more, but we're kind of enslaved in this thought process that we are just this, going to work, buying food, making dinner,
That's depressing.
going to sleep, rinse and repeat, because most of us live in this fear of, that we'll be homeless, or that we won't reach our potential, or we won't be able to pay our bills. And those are very real things. Believe me, I've experienced it all. But one of the messages that I received about that, this is such a great quote. And when it came through, I was like, oh, that's so good. Fear is a pesky little parasite that feeds on those so strong. And when you think about it, about what a parasite is, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like candida is a fungus parasite, right? And it thrives on sugar, and sugar is terrible for us, but it keeps eating sugar and making you crave for sugar. And fear is so much like that, right? It just feeds on itself, the worry and the fear, and there's so many layers.
fear, it's a low vibration, I feel like. So it's like if you're operating from a lower vibration, then fear has something to feed off of. However, if you try to elevate to a different vibration, then fear no longer has a life force to feed off of.
When there's love, because earlier we talked about your choices are either fear-based or love-based, right? So
Right.
when we live in a vibration of choosing love over fear and constantly changing your program, if you will, because the neural patterns in our brains are laying down programs, which, from 0 to 7 years old, our brains are in theta state. So theta is hypnosis. So we've been programmed from childhood, and then we perpetuate that program throughout our lives with just different scenarios, different people. But if we start shifting the program into choosing love-based decisions versus fear-based decisions, then you're right, it has nothing to feed off of. We are strong. It's in our belief of our weakness that fear can take hold of us.
Ooh, yep. I like that.
Just got to chill. There you go.
Yeah.
Love that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, and that's definitely the practical way of approaching it, for sure,
Yeah.
of what I said. And I love the way you put it. Thank you.
Yeah.
So you said that you do Reiki.
I used to,
Oh,
yes.
you used to. Okay. Why did you stop?
To me, it's a part of the evolution of our, I'll call it my spiritual tool belt. I've taken a lot of different modalities and classes and things like that, and you use the tools until you don't need the tools anymore. We as humans don't realize how powerful we are. And so we think we need to take classes and use different tools and things like that. And that's part of the process. So that's okay. That's great. I love Reiki. I think Reiki is a wonderful modality that is so gentle and so powerful at the same time. And it was part of my journey. So I write about it in the book about how Reiki happened to me. It was amazing. It was my first out of body experience. So I'm all for it. Over the years, and when I had the wellness center, I was doing, maybe like 5, 6, 7 sessions a day for years. And so it morphed into basically just whatever energy was coming through from source. And now that's what I do is I commune with source energy, and it's whatever. And I do that through Zooms. And so it's not that I never would do Reiki, but I don't really call it that anymore. I think it's just more of an expanded awareness of the energy work that I do.
So the question I had specifically about it was, do you feel like there is maybe certain practitioners or methods of approaching Reiki that could be harmful to people? Because I had a Christian upbringing,
Mhm.
I've been conditioned to believe that Reiki bad,
Yes.
essentially.
Yes.
And I don't believe that Reiki is inherently bad. I feel like there's a possibility of maybe channeling some kind of energy that's not
Yes.
productive or good
Yes.
for you.
Yeah, and that's any kind of channeling or anytime you're tapping into the spirit world, because the dark side is very tricky. And unless you end up knowing through tough experiences. Like I used to think everything was just, love energy and everything was just, that. I didn't until I experienced darkness firsthand. And then I'm like, oh, I don't want to play in that realm. Right? That is not the realm I'm going to play in. In shamanism work, I've done some shamanism work and they play in the darker realms. I have no interest in playing in darker realms. And so I've experienced things like, ayahuasca and dark entities attaching. I've done exorcism. Somebody had a demon that I was like, I don't ever want to do that again. Calling on Archangel Michael. And so, yes, there are dark entities, there are dark spirits, and they are liars. And they, will tell you that they're something that they're not. But there's a universal law that you have to ask if they are from the light, but you have to do it 3 times. So by the 3rd time, they have to say who they are. Most people don't know that. So you might say, are you from the light? And the energy would say yes. And then you go on your merry way thinking that you're working with a light energy. You're not. It's tricky. And that's why I go direct. now. Not playing with anything else but spirit from Creator, Jesus. That's it.
That was really rich. So I do want to ask you one last thing to wrap it up. If you were to give, I guess, a mission statement,
Oh,
if there was one thing that you would like to convey to all the listeners, what would you say?
oh my gosh. There's actually several because they have like little buckets. As far as the near-death experience, I just want people to know that there's no death, only life, and no attachment, right? So that's the message there. But to get to really the juiciness and the yumminess of really embodying that, you have to love yourself. There's a free book on my website, and the free book is called Roadmap to Living Mindfully, Understanding Self-Love, Self-Care, and Self-Mastery. If we don't do the self-love and self-care piece, we will never get to the mastery piece. You can't jump. You have to go through the progression. So we always start here. It's not selfish. It's a must. That program of it being selfish to think of yourself is a program. So we have to start here before we can be anything to anybody else. And you nourish yourself mindfully, and then you just give from the overflow.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for sharing that with me
You're
and
welcome.
for spending time with me today, having this
So much fun.
conversation.
You're adorable. I love you.
Thank you so much for listening to my podcast. If you loved this episode, please consider leaving a review. If you're listening on YouTube, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe so we don't lose each other. And just share the link with somebody who can appreciate this message. Blessings to you all, and I hope to catch you on my next episode.